Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining me today. I would like to walk you through something that's been widely taught, often repeated, and very rarely examined carefully from those who adhere to the Christian Zionist teaching of Ezekiel 38, Gog and Magog. What will follow isn't a new theory, and it isn't coming out of a modern political narrative shaped by figures like Pete Hegseth, Paula White, Lindsey Graham, or other voices within the Trump administration who have been echoing similar interpretations through a Christian Zionist lens, which is now on a global scale. What we're dealing with here goes much deeper, and it deserves to be read from the text itself, not from what's being projected onto it by Christian Zionists. The text in Ezekiel 38 is grounded in how carefully Christian scholars and Christian apologists have consistently approached it, reading it within the whole counsel of Scripture, rather than isolating it into modern geopolitics as we see today. When Ezekiel 38 is read in its proper biblical context and alongside its echo in the book of Revelation, it becomes clear that Gog and Magog aren't about identifying modern nations, dear viewers. Rather, it concerns a final, God-defined confrontation where his sovereignty is revealed before all nations in the world. Ezekiel 38 within Christian Zionist circles is the most quoted chapter in the Bible, and they use it alongside what's occurring today with the Iran war. Ezekiel 38 is a prophecy, and one of the most misunderstood, not to mention also misinterpreted prophecy in the Bible. You've probably heard the teaching before regarding who Gog and Magog is. Russia being Gog, Iran being Persia, and Turkey being 𝐂𝐤𝐳𝐞𝐤𝐢𝐴. Every time conflicts break out in the Middle East, someone opens Ezekiel 38 and declare, this is that prophecy. However, if we slow down and read the Bible carefully, something becomes very, very clear. That interpretation isn't coming from the text itself, not at all. The prophecy begins like this, right? Son of man, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and that's in Ezekiel 38 too. Now, the modern teaching claims that the word Rosh means Russia. However, in Hebrew, Rosh simply means chief or head. It also means the same in Lebanese Arabic. We say Ras, R-A-S-H, Ras. The Hebrews say Rosh. That's why most translation in the Bible render it exactly as it appears in Hebrew. Chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. Already, the foundation of Russia interpretation begins to weaken, even at that one word, rightly interpreted. However, the bigger issue is something else entirely as well. Most people read Ezekiel 38 without reading what comes before it. And as Chris Roseborough always says, context, context, context. And this changes everything. In Ezekiel 38, God promises to restore Israel. I will take you from among the nations and gather you out of all countries. That's in Ezekiel 36:24. Then in Ezekiel 37, we see the famous vision of the dry bones. Behold, I will cause breath to enter into you, and you shall live. Ezekiel 37:5. The nation that was dead, being Israel, is brought back to life. But the prophecy doesn't stop there, dear viewers. God then promises that his people will be united under one shepherd. My servant David shall be king over them, and they shall all have one shepherd. And that's in Ezekiel 37:24. This is a clear messianic promise. Restoration, resurrection, messianic rule. Only after these things does Ezekiel introduce Gog, which tells us something crucial, absolutely crucial. This prophecy isn't describing Israel barely surviving a political crisis, my goodness. It's actually describing what happens after restoration and peace. Ezekiel even says the people are dwelling securely at the time. You will come up against my people Israel, dwelling safely. Ezekiel 38:16, that text is in. Then the nations, they gather for an attack. The nations, not just a certain particular few nation. But here's the detail that's often overlooked. Israel doesn't win the war. God wins the war, viewers. Ezekiel describes divine judgment. There shall be a great earthquake in the land of Israel. Ezekiel 38:19. I will call for a sword against him throughout all my mountains. Ezekiel 38:21. I will rain upon him fire and brimstone. Ezekiel 38:22. This isn't a military victory. It's a divine intervention. God intervening akin to what he did in Sodom. And Ezekiel tells us exactly what God does, exactly why God does it, right? So I will magnify myself and sanctify myself, and I will be known in the eyes of many nations. That's in Ezekiel 38:23. The purpose of the prophecy, viewers, isn't geopolitical, nor is it a geopolitical prediction or prophecy. The purpose is the revelation of God's glory before the nations. And when we keep reading, the Bible tells us something quite fascinating that happens. The prophecy appears again. And where does it appear again? At the very end of Scripture, the end of the Bible, in the book of Revelation. And they went up on the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints. These saints, pivotal. And fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. Revelation 29. Notice a similarity. Nations gather. God intervenes. Fire falls from heaven. The rebellion ends right there and then. In other words, the New Testament reads Ezekiel 38 as part of the final rebellion of the nations against God. Not a modern political alliance, neither a modern state of Israel of 1948. And the thing is, once you see that connection, Ezekiel 38 starts opening in completely different way. In the next part, I'll look carefully at who Gog actually is and why the nations listed by Ezekiel represents the outer edges of the ancient world and not modern superpowers of today. Gog and Magog, they're not just characters in Ezekiel. They become part of the Bible's larger story about the final rebellion against God from the nations around the globe. I hope this has helped in some ways, and I hope that you will share for those who are interested to know what is going on here with Gog and Magog and the misinterpretation or the ongoing rhetoric of Christian Zionists who do not understand nor comprehend or coherently interpret the Bible through its context and its meaning. Please like, share, subscribe if you haven't, if this has interested you. And hopefully in a week or two, I will come along with part 2 of who Gog really is. Thank you for joining me. Until the next time, au revoir.